I opened my eyes to a ceiling I had never seen before. Gold crown molding tracing patterns above a bed twice the size of mine. And the first thing I felt was the weight on my left hand. A ring. Heavy, cold, unmistakably real, sitting on my finger like it had always been there. My head was pounding, my mouth was dry, and for a moment I genuinely believed I was still dreaming, because the last thing I remembered was leaving my sister's engagement party with a glass of champagne in my hand and a headache creeping behind my eyes. I sat up too fast and the room spun. Silk sheets pooled around me, sheets I didn't own. In a bedroom the size of my entire apartment, floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a private garden with a fountain that probably cost more than my yearly salary. Everything about the space screamed money, old money, the kind that doesn't advertise itself because it doesn't need to. And there, on the nightstand beside a glass of water I hadn't poured, was a folded piece of paper with my name written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize. Before I could reach for it, the door opened and a man walked in like he owned the room, because he did. Tall, dark-suited even at what must have been mid-morning, with the kind of composed stillness that told me immediately this was not a man who raised his voice to get what he wanted. He didn't need to. His eyes found the ring on my hand before they found my face, and something in his jaw eased, like he'd been holding his breath since the door opened. "You're awake," he said, and his voice was low, aching, dangerous in its calm. "Good. We have a lot to talk about, Mrs. Moretti." I remember laughing, actually laughing because the name sounded like something out of a film, not something that belonged to me, but he didn't laugh. He walked closer, sat on the edge of the bed like it was the most natural thing in the world, and told me plainly, sigh, that we had gotten married the night before, that I had said yes, that there were witnesses, a priest, a signed certificate sitting in a drawer downstairs with my own signature on it, shaky but unmistakably mine. I want to tell you that I screamed, that I fought, that I demanded answers the way any sane person would. And I did, eventually, once the shock wore off enough for anger to take its place. But in that very first moment, all I could do was stare at the ring and try to remember a wedding I apparently walked through with my own 2 feet. His name was Dante Moretti, and by the time the sun set that day, I understood exactly what kind of family I had married into. Not through him, he was careful with his words, deliberate in what he revealed and when. I understood it through the men stationed outside every door, through the way the household staff wouldn't meet my eyes, through the bulletproof glass in the study windows that no ordinary businessman would ever need. I hadn't chosen this life. I had been at that party for one reason only, to support my sister on the happiest night of her engagement. And somewhere between my second glass of champagne and the parking lot, my memory simply stopped. Dante told me I had been introduced to him that night by a mutual acquaintance, that we had talked for hours, that I had agreed to something I now had no recollection of agreeing to. He said it so smoothly, so convincingly, that for a moment I almost believed the story was mine too. But grief and instinct don't lie, and something in me knew this wasn't a whirlwind romance. This was a transaction, and I was the currency. It took me 3 days to find the courage to go through his study while he was away, and what I found confirmed every fear I'd been too afraid to say out loud. My father owed the Moretti family a debt, one accumulated over years of bad business decisions and worse company, a debt large enough that the only currency capable of settling it was his daughter. I confronted Dante the moment he walked through the door that evening, the paper still clutched in my hand, my voice shaking with a fury I didn't know I had in me. I expected him to deny it, to spin some smoother version of the truth the way powerful men always do. Instead, he simply looked at the papers, then at me, and told me the truth was worse than I thought. My father hadn't just owed money. He had stolen from the Moretti organization, funneled funds meant for a legitimate business front into his own failing ventures. And when it was discovered, there were only 2 ways that debt could be settled. One ended with my father's name in an obituary. The other ended with a ring on my finger. I hated him for it. I hated my father more, if I'm honest, for a decision he never gave me the chance to refuse. But hatred, I learned quickly, is a complicated thing when you're forced to live inside the same walls as the person you're aiming it at. Dante wasn't cruel to me. He never raised a hand, never raised his voice, never treated me like property despite the circumstances that bound us together. If anything, he seemed almost careful with me, like he was navigating something he hadn't quite prepared for either. It was weeks before I learned the rest of it, that Dante hadn't wanted this marriage any more than I had, that his own father, the aging head of the family, had orchestrated the entire arrangement as a way to bind two bloodlines together and settle a debt in one calculated move, using both of us as pieces on a board neither of us had agreed to play. Dante had pushed back, apparently, harder than I would have expected from a man in his position. But in that world, refusing your father's orders wasn't simply disobedience. It was a liability, one that could get people killed. I started to see him differently after that, not as my captor, but as another person trapped in the same gilded cage, just from a different door. We began to talk, really talk, late at night when the house was quiet and the weight of our circumstances felt slightly less crushing. He told me about a childhood spent watching his father teach him that loyalty was worth more than love, that mercy was a weakness the family couldn't afford. I told him about a father who gambled away our stability piece by piece until there was nothing left to gamble but me. Somewhere in those conversations, something shifted, quiet and unspoken, the kind of change you don't notice happening until you're already standing in the middle of it. I stopped flinching when he entered a room. He stopped speaking to me like a business arrangement and started speaking to me like a person whose opinion mattered to him. It wasn't love, not yet, not something either of us were ready to name. But it was something real, growing in a place neither of us expected to find anything real at all. The danger, of course, never disappeared. It simply moved to the background while we weren't looking. There was a rival family, the Castellanos, who had wanted this alliance to fail from the very beginning. Because a united Moretti family was a threat to territory they'd spent years trying to claim. When they realized the marriage wasn't the disaster they'd hoped for, they decided to intervene directly. And one night, 3 months into a marriage that had somehow become the most honest relationship of my life, they came for me. I remember the sound of glass shattering downstairs before I remember anything else, Dante's body suddenly between me and the door before I even understood what was happening. I remember him telling me to stay behind him in a voice I hadn't heard before, one stripped of all its careful calm, replaced with something raw and protective and terrifyingly real. I remember the sound of gunfire in a house that had, until that moment, felt like the safest place I'd ever lived. He got me out. He got himself hurt doing it. A wound to his shoulder that bled through his shirt as he pulled me through a hidden passage I hadn't even known existed, built generations ago for exactly this kind of emergency. We spent that night in a safe house 2 hours outside the city, him bleeding, me shaking, both of us finally saying the things we'd been too afraid to say inside a house full of listening ears and watching eyes. He told me he hadn't expected to feel anything for the woman his father forced into his life. I told him I hadn't expected to feel safe with the man meant to be my prison. And somewhere in that small, dimly lit safe house, surrounded by danger on every side, we finally admitted that whatever this had started as, it had become something neither of us was willing to walk away from. The Castellanos didn't win that night, and in the months that followed, Dante made sure they never got close enough to try again. He restructured alliances, called in debts of his own, made it clear in ways I never asked the details of that his wife was not a weakness to be exploited, but a line no one would be allowed to cross twice. My father, for his part, disappeared from both our lives entirely, the debt settled, the consequences of his choices finally landing squarely where they belonged, far away from me. It's been over a year now since I woke up in that mansion with a ring on my finger and no memory of how it got there. I won't pretend the beginning wasn't a nightmare, because it was, every bit as terrifying as it sounds. But somewhere between the fear and the danger and the world I never asked to be part of, I found a partner who chose me back, even when choosing me came at a cost. I didn't marry into the mafia by choice, but I stayed by choice. And in the end, what are sentenced and die at? That's the only part of the story that was ever really mine to decide.